This is HOA catastrophe. It started with snow and ended with a board meltdown. You think you can ignore me? Watch what happens next. That is what Lisa Carter screamed at me, standing on my driveway at 7 in the morning, pointing at a thin layer of slush near my front steps. I had cleared the walkway an hour earlier, scraped every inch down to concrete, but the temperature had climbed just enough to melt the edges, and now she was calling it a violation. Lisa is the rules enforcement chair for Beacon Hill HOA here in Pembroke Pines, Florida, and she treats every snow event like a federal disaster. She had a lanyard with a blank HOA badge clipped to her red parka, and she was holding a small handheld salt shaker like it was evidence in a murder trial. I work as a construction project coordinator and my workday starts early. I cannot spend the morning fighting a toe in the snow, but Lisa did not care. She pulled out her phone and started typing a citation right there, her breath making little clouds in the cold air. The slush was barely a quarter-inch deep and it was already melting, but she told me the rule was zero tolerance and she was fining me on the spot. I asked her to show me the exact language in the covenant, and she snapped that she did not need to because she wrote the enforcement memos herself. That was the first red flag. I have lived in Beacon Hill for 3 years, and I have never seen an enforcement memo that was not approved by the full board. But Lisa has a habit of acting like her word is law. She tapped her screen one more time and said the fine was $50, and if I did not clear the slush within 2 hours it would double. Then she turned and walked back toward her car, which was parked at the curb with a reflective triangle marker set near the wheel, like she was a city inspector. I grabbed my phone and took photos of the walkway, the slush, the temperature reading on my weather app, and the timestamp. Then I went inside and pulled up the CC and Rs on my laptop. I have a renovation schedule in progress, and delays could cost me thousands, so I need to keep this HOA nonsense from spiraling. The document loaded, and I scrolled to the winter maintenance section. The rule said property owners must clear walkways of snow and ice within 24 hours of the end of precipitation. It said nothing about slush, it said nothing about instant fines, it said nothing about 2-hour deadlines. I screenshotted the section and emailed it to the HOA management company with a polite note asking them to clarify the slush policy. Then I went back outside with a bag of salt and spread it over the wet spots, even though they were already drying in the sun. I was not taking chances. Lisa had a reputation for stacking violations, and I knew she would be back. By noon, the walkway was bone dry. I checked my email and saw that the management company had replied, but the message was vague. They said they would review my concern and get back to me within 5 business days. That was not good enough. I had already received a formal notice in my mailbox, printed on Beacon Hill letterhead, listing the $50 fine and threatening additional penalties if I did not comply with future directives. The notice was dated that morning, and it had Lisa's name at the bottom as the issuing officer. I called my friend Marcus, a local paralegal who helps me organize evidence packets for work disputes. He told me to document everything and to request a formal hearing if the fine was not reversed. He also told me to check the enforcement policy in the HOA bylaws, because most associations require a written warning before a fine, and Lisa had skipped that step entirely. I thanked him and hung up. Then I pulled the bylaws from my file cabinet and started reading. The bylaws were clear. Enforcement required a written warning with a 10-day cure period before any fine could be issued. Lisa had gone straight to the fine. That was step 1 of my case, but I needed more. I grabbed my laptop and started searching the HOA online portal for past enforcement actions. The portal was a mess. Half the links were broken, but I found a folder labeled Winter Compliance and opened it. Inside were dozens of notices, all signed by Lisa, all skipping the warning step, all targeting different homeowners for minor violations like snow piles too close to the curb or ice melt stains on the driveway. I downloaded every file and saved them to a folder on my desktop. Then I started cross-referencing the dates. Lisa had issued 23 fines in the past 2 winters, and not one of them had a corresponding warning letter on file. That was a pattern. That was ammunition. 2 days later, I got an email from the management company. They said they had reviewed my complaint and determined that the fine was valid because Lisa had observed the violation in person, and the slush created a potential slip hazard. They said I could appeal at the next board meeting, which was 3 weeks away, but the fine would remain on my account until then. I replied immediately and attached the bylaw section showing the warning requirement. I asked them to explain why Lisa was allowed to skip that step. They did not respond. That same afternoon, I got a second notice in my mailbox. This one said I had failed to remove wet boot trays from my front porch, and that they were visible from the street, which violated the aesthetic standards clause. The fine was another $50. I walked out to my porch and looked at the boot trays. They were small black rubber mats tucked against the wall, barely noticeable unless you were standing on my walkway. Lisa had to have been on my property to see them. I took more photos. I measured the distance from the street to the porch. I checked the aesthetic standards clause in the CC&Rs, and it said nothing about boot trays. It mentioned holiday decorations, lawn ornaments, and exterior paint colors, but nothing about functional winter gear. I added the photos and measurements to my evidence folder and sent another email to the management company. This time, I copied the entire board. Marcus called me that night and told me to file a formal dispute in writing and to request an emergency hearing. He said the HOA was using fine stacking to pressure me into paying without fighting back, and that it was a common tactic in associations where the board had too much power. He also said I should check the meeting minutes to see if the winter enforcement policy had ever been voted on, because if it had not, then Lisa was operating on her own authority. I stayed up late that night searching the online portal for meeting minutes. The portal only had records going back 2 years, but I found what I was looking for. There was a draft agenda from December 2 winters ago that included a proposal to update the winter enforcement policy. The proposal was listed as tabled for further review. There was no follow-up. There was no vote. There was no approved policy. I copied the agenda and added it to my folder. Then I drafted a formal dispute letter citing the missing warning, the lack of an approved policy, and the fact that Lisa had been on my property without permission. I printed 3 copies, mailed one to the management company, mailed one to the board president, and kept one for my records. I also requested an emergency hearing and asked for the enforcement actions to be suspended pending review. The next morning I woke up to find a tow warning sticker on my car. The sticker said my vehicle was parked in violation of the snow emergency rules and that it would be towed within 24 hours if I did not move it to an approved location. My car was parked in my own driveway. I looked around and saw that no other cars on the street had stickers. Just mine. I called the towing company listed on the sticker and asked them who had requested the tow. They said it was the HOA and that they had a standing contract for enforcement. I asked them to send me a copy of the contract, and they said they could not do that without HOA approval. I hung up and called the management company. They put me on hold for 15 minutes and then told me the tow request had been initiated by the rules enforcement chair and that I needed to take it up with her directly. I did not want to talk to Lisa, but I did not have a choice. I walked over to her house, which was 4 doors down from mine, and knocked. She opened the door with the same smug look she always had and asked me what I wanted. I told her about the tow sticker and asked her to explain why my car was being targeted. She smiled and said that the snow emergency rules required all vehicles to be parked on the street during active snow events so that plow trucks could access driveways. I told her there had not been any snow in 3 days and the streets were clear. She shrugged and said the rules stayed in effect until the board issued an all-clear notice, and that had not happened yet. Then she held up her little salt shaker and said, "I do not care what the weather did. I care what the rule says." I asked her to show me the rule in writing, and she told me to check the portal. Then she closed the door. I went home and checked the portal. There was no snow emergency rule. There was no all-clear notice system. There was nothing. I called Marcus again and told him what was happening. He said I needed to escalate immediately because the HOA was harassing me, and that could be grounds for an injunction. He said to document every interaction, every notice, every sticker, and every email, and to start building a timeline. He also said I should check the towing contract to see if the HOA had the authority to order tows from private driveways, because in most cases they did not. I spent the rest of the day building the timeline. I listed every violation notice, every fine, every tow threat, and every refusal to provide documentation. I added dates, times, and screenshots. I also checked my security camera footage and found clips of Lisa walking onto my porch to photograph the boot trays and walking up to my car to place the tow sticker. She had been on my property 3 times in the past week, without permission. That night I got an email from the management company. They said my dispute packet had been lost and that I needed to resubmit it. I replied with a PDF of the entire packet attached and asked for confirmation of receipt. They did not respond. The next morning I woke up to find my car still in the driveway, but now there was a bright orange boot clamp on the front wheel. I walked outside in my parka and stared at it. The clamp had a phone number printed on the side and a warning that tampering with it would result in additional fines. I called the number and got a voicemail. I left a message asking for an explanation, and then I called the management company again. They put me on hold again. This time I waited 20 minutes before someone picked up. The voice on the other end was bored and annoyed. They said the clamp was part of the escalated enforcement process and that I could have it removed by paying the outstanding fines and a removal fee. I asked how much the removal fee was and they said $200. I told them I was not paying anything until I got a hearing, and they said the hearing was still scheduled for 3 weeks out and that there was nothing they could do to move it up. I hung up and called Marcus. He told me to take photos of the clamp, the car, the driveway, and anything else that showed the HOA was overreaching. He also told me to file a police report for harassment and to request that the clamp be removed as an illegal restraint. I did not think the police would care, but I called anyway. The dispatcher said they would send someone out. The officer who showed up was young and looked like he did not want to be there. He asked me what the problem was and I explained the whole situation. He listened, took notes, and then told me that HOA disputes were civil matters and that he could not remove the clamp without a court order. He said I could file a report for trespassing if I wanted, but it probably would not go anywhere. I filed the report anyway and got a case number. That afternoon, Lisa showed up at my door again. This time she was holding a clipboard with a stack of papers and she had her phone out, recording. She said she was conducting a compliance inspection and that I needed to let her walk through my yard to check for code violations. I told her no. She said that the CC&Rs gave the HOA the right to inspect properties with 24 hours notice and that she had sent me an email. The day before. I checked my phone and there was no email. She held up her phone screen and showed me a screenshot of an email sent to an address that was not mine. It was off by 1 letter. I pointed that out and she said it was not her fault if I had not updated my contact information. Then she said, "Make it public. I love watching people get embarrassed." I told her to leave and she smiled and said she would add refusal to cooperate to my violation list. Then she walked back to her car, still recording. I called Marcus immediately. He said that was gold. He said to save the security footage, to keep the police report on file, and to add the clipboard stunt to the timeline. He also said that Lisa was escalating because she knew I was building a case and that she was trying to bury me in fines before I could get to a hearing. He told me to stay calm and to keep collecting evidence, because we were going to bury her instead. 2 days later, I got another email from the management company. This time it said my dispute packet had been received, but that it was incomplete because I had not included proof of payment for the outstanding fines. I replied and told them that the fines were the subject of the dispute and that I was not paying them until the hearing. They replied and said that failure to pay would result in a lien being placed on my property. I forwarded the entire chain to Marcus. He called me an hour later and said we needed to move faster. He said the HOA was trying to force me into a corner where I would either pay or lose my house, and that we needed to file an injunction to stop the enforcement actions immediately. He said he could help me draft the paperwork, but I would need to file it myself because he was not a licensed attorney. I told him to send me the templates and I would handle it. That night I stayed up late filling out forms. I listed every violation, every fine, every tow threat, every clamp, every trespass, and every refusal to provide documentation. I attached the timeline, the screenshots, the security footage, the police report, and the meeting minutes showing the missing policy vote. I printed everything and put it in a binder. Then I drove to the courthouse the next morning and filed for an emergency injunction. The clerk told me it would take a few days to get a hearing date and that I would be notified by mail. I asked if there was any way to expedite it, and she said only if I could show immediate harm. I showed her the photo of the boot clamp and the lien threat email. She made a note and said she would flag it for the judge. 3 days later, I got a notice in the mail. The hearing was scheduled for the following week, the day before the regular HOA board meeting. That was tight, but it gave me time to prepare. Marcus came over, and we rehearsed my statement. He told me to stick to the facts, to stay calm, and to let the evidence speak for itself. He also told me to bring the clipboard incident up last, because it showed Lisa was retaliating, and that would make the judge angry. The hearing was in a small courtroom downtown. I showed up early and sat in the front row with my binder. Lisa walked in 10 minutes later with the HOA attorney, a man in a gray suit who looked annoyed to be there. They sat on the other side of the room and did not look at me. The judge came in and we all stood. Then the hearing started. The judge asked me to explain why I was requesting an injunction. I walked him through the timeline. I showed him the missing warning letters, the unapproved enforcement policy, the tow threats, the boot clamp, the lien threat, and the trespass incidents. I kept my voice steady and I stuck to the facts. The judge listened and took notes. Then he asked the HOA attorney to respond. The attorney stood up and said that the HOA had the authority to enforce its rules and that I was being non-compliant. He said the fines were valid and that the lien was a standard consequence for unpaid fees. He said the boot clamp was part of the escalation process and that I had been given multiple opportunities to resolve the issue. Then he sat down. The judge looked at him and asked if the HOA had documentation showing that the enforcement policy had been approved by the board. The attorney paused and then said he would need to check with his client. The judge asked Lisa to stand. She stood, and he asked her directly if the policy had been voted on. She said yes. He asked her when. She said she did not remember the exact date. He asked her to provide the meeting minutes showing the vote. She said she did not have them with her. If you are enjoying this chaos, smash that like button, subscribe for more wild HOA stories where the Karens get destroyed by their own rules. The judge told her to sit down. Then he turned to me and asked if I had the meeting minutes. I opened my binder and handed him the printed agenda showing the tabled proposal. He read it, looked at Lisa, and then looked at the attorney. He said, "This shows no vote occurred." The attorney started to object, and the judge cut him off. He said, "I am granting the injunction. All enforcement actions are suspended immediately. The boot clamp will be removed today at HOA expense. The fines are voided pending a full board review. The lien threat is dismissed." He banged his gavel and walked out. Lisa stood up and glared at me. She did not say anything, but I could see her hands shaking. The attorney grabbed his briefcase and left without looking at either of us. I packed up my binder and walked out of the courthouse. Marcus was waiting in the parking lot, and I told him what happened. He grinned and said, "That is round one. Now we finish her." The next day, the boot clamp was gone. I got an email from the management company saying the fines had been removed from my account and that the enforcement actions were suspended pending review. They did not apologize. They did not explain. They just moved on like nothing had happened. I forwarded the email to Marcus and he told me to get ready for the board meeting because Lisa was going to try to spin the story and we needed to shut that down. The board meeting was held in the clubhouse at the neighborhood entrance. I showed up early and sat in the back row. The room filled up slowly. About 20 homeowners were there, most of them looking bored. Lisa sat at the front table with the rest of the board, her lanyard and salt shaker both visible. The board president called the meeting to order and started going through the agenda. When they got to enforcement updates, Lisa stood up and started talking. She said the HOA had been working hard to maintain compliance during the winter months and that a few residents had been resistant to following the rules. She did not mention my name, but everyone knew who she was talking about. She said the association had taken appropriate action and that the issue was now resolved. Then, she started to sit down. I raised my hand. The board president looked annoyed, but he called on me. I stood up and said I wanted to clarify the record. I said that the enforcement actions Lisa had taken were not appropriate and that they had been suspended by court order because she had been operating without an approved policy. I said she had skipped required steps, issued fines without warnings, trespassed on my property, and threatened illegal tows. I said I had documentation and I was happy to share it with the board. Lisa stood up and said I was lying. The board president told her to sit down. She did not. She said I was trying to undermine the HOA and that I had been non-compliant from the start. I pulled out my phone and opened the security footage. I held it up so the board could see. The footage showed Lisa walking onto my porch, photographing the boot trays, and placing the tow sticker on my car. The room went quiet. The board president asked to see the footage. I walked up and handed him my phone. He watched it, then passed it to the board member next to him. They all watched it. Then the president looked at Lisa and asked her if she had been on my property without permission. She said she had the authority to inspect for violations. He asked her where that authority was written. She did not answer. One of the other board members, a woman in her 50s, spoke up. She said she had received similar complaints from other homeowners about Lisa issuing fines without warnings and that the board needed to review the enforcement process. She said the CC&Rs required warnings and that the board had never voted to waive that requirement. Another board member agreed. The president said they would table the enforcement updates and schedule a special session to review the policy. Lisa tried to object. The president told her to sit down. She sat, but her face was red, and she was gripping her salt shaker so hard her knuckles were white. The meeting moved on to other topics. I sat down and waited. About halfway through, a homeowner raised his hand and said he had something to add. The president called on him. The homeowner said he had been fined by Lisa for leaving a snow shovel visible from the street, and that he had paid the fine because he did not want to fight. He said he had since learned that the rule Lisa cited did not exist, and that he wanted a refund. Another homeowner spoke up and said the same thing had happened to her. Then, another. Within 5 minutes, 6 homeowners had shared similar stories. The board president looked at Lisa and asked her how many fines she had issued in the past 2 years. She said she did not have the exact number. I stood up again and said I did. I said I had downloaded the enforcement logs from the portal and that Lisa had issued 73 fines in 2 years and that none of them had corresponding warning letters. I said I had brought copies and I was happy to share them. The president asked me to email the files to the board. I said I would do it that night. Lisa stood up and walked out of the meeting. She slammed the door behind her. The room stayed quiet for a moment. Then the president said the board would conduct a full audit of the enforcement actions and that homeowners who had been improperly fined would receive refunds. He said the enforcement policy would be suspended until a new policy was drafted and voted on. He also said Lisa would be removed from the rules enforcement chair position effective immediately. The meeting ended about 20 minutes later. I walked out and saw Marcus waiting by the entrance. He asked how it went and I told him. He laughed and said, "That is how you kill a tyrant." I thanked him for his help and drove home. That night I emailed the enforcement logs to the board president. I also emailed the security footage, the police report, and the court injunction. I attached a note saying I expected a formal apology and a written assurance that no further enforcement actions would be taken against me without proper procedure. The next morning I got a reply from the president. He apologized on behalf of the board and said that Lisa had been acting outside her authority. He said the board would be issuing a memo clarifying the enforcement process and that all fines issued without warnings would be voided. He also said the HOA would cover the costs of the boot clamp removal and any other expenses I had incurred. He attached a draft of the new policy and asked for my feedback. I read the draft. It was clean. It required written warnings with a 10-day cure period before any fine could be issued. It required photographic evidence of violations. It required board approval for any enforcement action over $100. It prohibited HOA representatives from entering private property without written consent. I replied and said the policy looked good and that I had no objections. 2 weeks later, the board held another meeting to vote on the new policy. I did not attend, but I watched the live stream on the HOA website. The policy passed unanimously. Lisa was not at the meeting. I later heard from a neighbor that she had resigned from the board entirely and that she was considering moving out of the neighborhood. I did not feel bad for her. The HOA issued a memo clarifying the rule Karen weaponized, and it was distributed to every homeowner in Beacon Hill. The memo stated that Slush did not constitute a violation of the winter maintenance clause, and that enforcement would only occur after a formal written warning. It also stated that the boot tray aesthetic complaint was not a valid violation, and that functional winter gear was exempt from the aesthetic standards. I saved a copy of the memo and added it to my file. Karen's own selective enforcement got documented in the minutes, and the board published a summary of the audit on the HOA portal. The summary listed every improper fine Lisa had issued, the names of the affected homeowners, and the refund amounts. My name was on the list, along with the $50 slush fine and the $50 boot tray fine. Both were marked as voided. Karen's favorite fee gets proven imaginary in the ledger, because the audit revealed that Lisa had been charging a compliance review fee that did not exist in the fee schedule, and that she had pocketed the money herself. The board reported her to the management company, and the management company terminated her access to the portal. A month later, I was leaving for work early in the morning, and I saw Lisa at the neighborhood gate. She was arguing with the gate vendor technician, who was standing by his van with a tablet. I slowed down as I approached and heard her demanding to see the access logs. The technician told her he could not share that information without board authorization. She said she was on the board, and he said her name was not on the current authorization list. She started yelling, and he stepped back and called his supervisor. I rolled down my window and asked the technician if there was a problem. He said no, just a misunderstanding. Lisa turned and saw me, and her face went red. She started to say something, and I cut her off. I said, "I do not care what the weather did, I care what the rule says." She froze. Then I said, "Make it public, I love watching people get embarrassed." She turned and walked back to her car, without another word. I let the meeting move on, because my move was not a speech, it was a document. I had already sent a written reversal from management with a real citation to the board president the night before. The document was a copy of the enforcement policy showing Karen is skipping required steps on purpose, and I had attached a timeline proving she had done it systematically for 2 years. I had requested an emergency hearing and presented the evidence in the courthouse hallway at the last second, and the judge had granted the injunction on the spot. The gate technician read the access logs out loud to his supervisor on speakerphone. The logs showed that Lisa had tried to enter the gate system 11 times in the past week using her old credentials, and that all attempts had been denied. The supervisor told the technician to file a report and to notify the board. Lisa got in her car and drove away. I waved at the technician and drove out through the gate. I never saw Lisa at another HOA meeting after that. The renovation schedule stayed on track, and I did not lose a single day to HOA delays. The new enforcement policy worked exactly as written. The board started holding quarterly reviews of all enforcement actions, and homeowners were invited to attend. The management company hired a new compliance coordinator who actually followed the rules. Beacon Hill started to feel like a normal neighborhood again. I kept all the evidence in a folder on my desktop just in case, but I never needed it. The story got around the neighborhood fast, and other homeowners started pushing back on questionable fines. The board became more transparent, and the meetings became less toxic. A few months later, a neighbor who quietly says this happened to them too stopped me on the street and thanked me for fighting back. He said he had paid over $300 in bogus fines, and that the refund check had finally arrived. He said he wished he had stood up sooner. I told him it was never too late. I also told him to keep his own evidence folder, just in case the board ever tried to pull the same stunt again. He nodded and said he would. Then he asked me if I thought Lisa was really going to move. I said I did not know, and I did not care. I just wanted to live in my house without someone showing up every week to invent a new rule. The last time I saw Lisa, she was loading boxes into a moving truck. It was early spring and the snow was finally gone. I was out front working on my garden, and she drove past without looking at me. A neighbor told me later that she had sold her house and moved to a condo in a different part of town. I hoped the new HOA was ready for her. I never got a formal apology from Lisa, but I got something better. I got a written reversal from management with a real citation, and I got the satisfaction of watching her fake enforcement empire collapse under the weight of her own lies. I got my fines voided, my costs reimbursed, and my reputation cleared. I got a new enforcement policy that protected everyone in the neighborhood, not just me. And I got the knowledge that standing up to a bully works, as long as you have the evidence and the patience to see it through. I appreciate you hearing me out, and I will catch you next time.